The survival of future generations are really going to depend on what we know about forests because they play such a vital role in the future of our planet.
Healthy forests are sources of carbon sequestration and biodiversity.
We rely upon the forest to supply us with a variety of products, including lumber, cellulose for paper, and more recently, medicine and bioactive compounds.
To have a healthy forest is a productive forest, is a self-sustaining forest.
When I'm on my bike and going through the woods, it's just great going by all the different varieties of trees, listening to nature, very relaxing.
Forests are so accessible as viewscapes, as recreation and camping and wildlife.
Forests are clean water suppliers. They are natural water filters.
Forests are the lungs of the planet. So it's very important to keep those lungs healthy.
When we think about what's at stake today in the world's forests, there's a lot of things that come to mind. Even with our replanting efforts today, we're still losing nearly 5 million hectares of forest land every year. That is not sustainable. That we have to address. With that loss goes all that biodiversity, those animals, insects, fungus, the unknown compounds that may have medicinal value for society. Those are disappearing before we have an opportunity to discover them.
Stephen Nicholson is a dedicated and passionate forest health expert in Ontario, Canada. Recently retired and a wealth of information.
I've been involved with forest health and protection for 5 decades now. I didn't chart a career path in forest health, but it developed over time, and I became increasingly interested in it. I don't make a distinction what that utilization of that forest will be, but it was always my goal to try and keep that forest there.
The amount of information and knowledge Stephen has would take hours to do it justice. Fortunately, he was willing and eager to share his decades of experience with us. But he's not the only expert willing to share their stories. We have been able to connect to forest health professionals around the world, and each brings a unique perspective to forest health based on their experiences. They all play an important role in keeping forests healthy and want to share their expertise can continue to maintain the health of our global forests.
There's a bit of an expression, but when I think of forests, I think of trees. But when I think of a forest, I think of a forest as a complex living ecosystem. So forests are critical habitats for an array of biodiversity. Forested watershed will work as a natural water filtration plant, deliver clean, reliable water sources to downstream communities.
A forest canopy shelters the streams and provides shade, which provide cool temperatures. Certain species of fish, especially that sports fishermen like, need cool, highly oxygenated water. Where we are today, it's in a riparian watershed. We have a babbling brook going through a nice wooded area. This brook needs these trees and this type of an environment. It keeps the water nice and clean. In fact, that's why the fly fisherman behind us is here, because of the quality of the water.
There's a natural connection to the forest that is overwhelmingly important to the health of our planet. Forests are probably the largest living organism on the planet on ground. Of course, in the oceans, there's even larger ecosystems, but on the planet, on the ground, what's really the most important component of our ecosystems is forests.
Globally, trees and forests contribute so much to our everyday lives, but notably, the amount of carbon stored in forests is one of the main benefits they provide to us, especially as we begin discussing climate change and greenhouse gases.
Carbon is stored by plants undergoing photosynthesis, where they take the sunlight and basically transform it to store it in a form of energy they can use in the future, plus allocate it to growth. About half of plants, especially trees, are carbon. And that comes from years and years, decades, if not centuries, of photosynthesis. And the leaves that you see trees put out every spring really comes from photosynthesis that was stored in the prior year. The concern today of releasing a lot of those greenhouse gases, which will warm the planet.
There's a big push around the world, in Canada and BC, about sequestration of carbon. And there's one particular initiative in BC, Carbon Initiative. And forest health fits in very well in that we keep trees alive, prevent mortality, prevent defoliation, thus they're greener and sequester carbon. So that, I think, our program fits nicely into the greener economy and sort of trying to reduce carbon emissions and reduce climate change impacts.
Carbon sequestration is an important topic. Professionals and governments are paying close attention to not only the amount of carbon plants and trees sequester, but also the impacts when trees are harvested, burned, stressed, or die from other causes. According to the Boston Consulting Group, forests around the world have an estimated total value of as much as $150 trillion, with carbon storage contributing as much as 90% of that value.
An interesting aspect of forest health is trying to determine the value of a forest. Foresters can tell you what that tree is worth if it's cut into saw logs or furniture, turned into pulp and paper. The real intriguing challenge is to determine what's the value of that forest to somebody living in or near it. It's been generally recognized that people who live in a forest environment or close to one tend to be healthier than those that don't. And in fact, there was a study in 2022 that indicated that looking at this population of people who lived in and near a forest, across all cultures, all backgrounds, all socioeconomic levels, that those people reduced their costs of health by about $375 a year per person. So if you look at that, and I took that and said, well, if somebody lives to be 75 or 80, that rolls out to nearly $30,000 per person. So if you take a community of X thousands of people, you're not long in determining that having a forest to help maintain the health and the quality of life of those people, it's a very big return on your initial investment of planting a few more trees.
Humans need forests as a resource. The wood that grows in the forest is very important to the economy of Canada. It's very important to the economy of North America and pretty much all over the world. We have to make sure that our forests remain healthy so that they continue producing a certain amount, a sufficient amount of wood fiber and wood products for our economies to keep exploiting them without destroying the environment completely. So it's a balance between extracting resources and making sure that the ecosystems are healthy enough to remain and to keep producing these resources for us.
The forest is important in the big picture, especially for the regions of Quebec. A lot of communities in Quebec are surviving because of a sawmill that is installed there or a pulp mill is installed, and the hiring people in the region, bringing a lot of money in regions.
We need to be smart about how we go with harvesting our trees. It takes 60 to 80 years to have a tree grow and be able to have it brought here in the mill. So we have to take good care of each log that comes here and try to transform it and give it some love because we took a long time to make it grow. So why not put the effort and try to do a good quality product with it?
Well, to me, forests are fun. Fun to be in the forest.
The national forest here and the land that we live on is such a part of who we are and what we do here. Tourism is such a huge part of it, and the forest is what draws people here. All the other activities and things are wonderful additions, but it's basically just nature and the beauty and the peace that we have up here.
Forests are a tremendous place to experience recreational opportunities. Many people would say that they recognize forests as a place to experience spiritual opportunities. Something about connecting to the natural environment seems to go well in a forest. We know this because many of our national parks are places that are heavily forested, and people appreciate that.
Another thing in forestry is protecting the forest to maintain wildlife. So sometimes I've been involved in protecting deer yards where deer will overwinter, gather in the winter. So you want to keep foliage on. It's usually on fir. You want to keep foliage there so they can shelter under the boughs, which holds up the snow. Caribou in eastern Canada is a big issue, and in fact we've started in Quebec to protect some of their boreal forest for maintenance of caribou habitat. There's nothing to do with protective lumber. They're often in remote areas with very small trees. You're up close to the tree line, but that's where the caribou are. So there's a big initiative across eastern Canada from Ontario right through to Newfoundland to protect those areas for caribou. So wildlife habitat.
Animals and people. We both rely on forests for our well-being and survival. The Colorado Arts and Sciences magazine reported that 1.6 billion rural people live within 5 kilometers of a forest worldwide. And in America, 54% of Americans are forest proximate. That means many of us could experience being in a forest firsthand. But you don't need to be in a forest to feel its impact. Even if you're living in the largest of cities, take a moment to notice the trees lining your streets or in your local parks. Each of them are making an impact on your life.
The problems facing forest health are global. They're throughout the world, but particularly the deforestation of the Amazon and the other rainforests around the world is a big issue, and that's exploitation of forests, but also human encroachment into the forest environment that is reducing and reducing and reducing the surface area of the planet that is forested in natural forests. And that has a big impact on the health of the climatic system of the Earth, but also biodiversity, the abundance of life, and all of these issues. Those are global issues everywhere.
Deforestation is the willful abandonment or removing a forest with no thought of managing other than to replace that forest with some other purpose. Harvesting a forest is a natural part of economic value of a forest, where it's harvested, lumber for medicine, pulp and paper. When a forest harvest is conducted properly, a healthy forest is left behind. So there's always regeneration and replanting, often at a higher density with more trees than were removed.
Another threat receiving a lot more attention today than it had years ago is climate change. And while it affects everything on Earth, its impact on forests can't be overlooked.
For forests, climate change has a very, very strong impact because trees can't move. So a forest that is submitted to a changing climate, warmer or drier or wetter or whatever the climate change impact is locally, that forest is affected immediately and for a long time until it can reproduce and maybe migrate elsewhere very, very slowly.
The climate is changing in a number of ways across the country. Some places are having drought, other places are having excessive moisture, and that affects our forests.
We're seeing this with climate change, that what's been predicted for Pennsylvania, and we see this happening, is this increase in moisture in certain parts of the state over short periods of time, generally early in the year, spring, and then late in the year, but in between we're getting drought. So this puts a lot of impact on those trees, and it makes them susceptible to any kind of stress factors that come into play.
What we do know that's more related to the discipline that I'm in is that climate change also will have either direct or indirect effects on various components of forest ecosystems. And when I think about these things, I often think about those critical habitats that are kind of at the threshold of disturbance now. So when we consider landscapes that are already under threat from human-induced disturbances, other perhaps natural disturbances such as fire, forest fire, other disturbances that occur in these systems. So when you think about systems that are already under threat, and then you superimpose the risks that arrived from climate change, then it just becomes more confounding, more difficult to be able to manage all of those threats that are arriving at the same time.
Climate change impacts wildfires, of course, through increasing the frequency and severity across our landscape. But what we've really seen is shift in frequency and severity, and a notable date is actually the 2003 wildfire season in BC, shifting us into what's being called the Pyrocene, where we're seeing much more frequently these large wildfire seasons that are termed unprecedented. And then 2 years later, we're seeing a wildfire season that's termed unprecedented again. And we are seeing that those fires are burning at such a large area that fire crews aren't able to put out the entire perimeter of a fire, for example. And so you might see overwintering happening. When a fire overwinters, that means that it burns through the winter, typically underground in the root system or in a peat bog up in more of our boreal forest, where it's going to smolder under the snowpack. And then in the spring, when the snow melts, the fire is able to come back up out of the ground and can start another fire in the spring.
Fire needs three things. We have to have fuel, we have to have the right fire weather conditions, we have to have an ignition source. And you need all three. So if you've only got one of them, it's not going to work. You can have the fuel, but if you don't have the right weather conditions or an ignition source, you're not going to have a fire. The Canadian Forest Service scientists in the 1970s and 80s that were working with fire did experimental burns in different fuel types, and these included budworm-killed forest. A scientist named Brian Stocks led this work, and he found that it was a really explosive fuel type. So there definitely is a connection. Insects kill forest and produce lots of fuel kind of on the ground. It undoubtedly has contributed to the major forest fires that we're seeing.
How do we make the most out of what we have left? Because we have far more wildfires, as 2021 has shown us, which puts a whole other wrinkle on managing our land base. We saw towns being devastated, but from a forest health perspective, fire-scarred trees become very attractive to certain insects. So again, we've got this web that we're seeing more fires and more severe fires. They're impacting the trees along with the drought.
Climate change certainly has a role to play in forest health, But what lives in the forest also plays a huge impact as well.
There's lots of forest insects. You'll see them anytime you're in the woods. The ones that have the most notoriety, the ones that are most noticeable, are the ones that cause the most damage. When we refer to forest pests, we automatically assume it's invasive insects, but there's quite a few native insects that threaten the health of a forest from time to time. The difference between an invasive and a native insect is that the native insect has evolved over time and has its own natural checks and balances. Other organisms that will feed on that native insect. And over time, they will keep that, what we would refer to as a pest because it's defoliating or having an impact on the forest, it will keep that in control. When invasive insects arrive, they usually come without their natural controls.
Lymantria dispar, the spongy moth, which replaced the common name gypsy moth in 2022. This new name refers to their sponge-like egg masses, each of which can contain up to 600 eggs. The spongy moth is found in many countries around the world. While they prefer oak, these pests prey on over 500 species of trees and shrubs, many of which can be found in your backyard or city parks. Spongy moth infestations appear sporadically, but when there's an outbreak, it can last for several years, destroying millions of acres of forest in North America and Europe, causing billions of dollars in damage. The pine processionary moth, native to the Mediterranean basin, is primarily a pine tree defoliator, but more importantly, it poses a public health concern. An example of its impact can be found on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus.
Cyprus is a beautiful touristic island, and forest is a very important part of tourism in Cyprus. Forest is also very important for ecology. If we don't have forest, then we don't have rain, and drought is a great problem in Cyprus, causes great fire risk. But pine processionary moth gives more harm to the forest than the fires. Pine processionary moth is given a lot of damage also, so it is also a big risk for the forest. Therefore, the control of pine processionary moth is very, very valuable in our area. It's very, very important. And both government and people of Cyprus give great importance to this because people want to be comfortable and free to go to the forest.
There are a series of insects that are a threat to the forest, but they're actually more of a threat to people and animals in and near the forest. Things like processionary moths. Those are all members of the tussock family. They have long hairs. And those hairs are shed every time the insect molts. And people have severe allergens. They'll break out in hives.
Forest insects and diseases have significant ecological and economic impacts across the country. Emerald ash borer, or EAB as it's known, has arrived in this country, and the ash trees just did not have any resistance. There's no host resistance to EAB. They've also arrived without any parasites or predators, but for EAB, I think host resistance is really important. In Asia, where emerald ash borer is native to, the ash trees are more resistant, and you don't see the emerald ash borer having impacts on the native Asian species of ash as you do to the North American species of ash. In fact, when you plant North American ash in Asia, even though those parasites and predators are there, those North American ash trees are killed by EAB. And in North America, if you plant an Asian species of ash tree, they don't die in North America. So it is really a case of host resistance or lack of host resistance that's important.
Since arriving in North America, the emerald ash borer moved quickly, now infesting most of eastern North America. Many communities now need to remove dead ash trees from roadsides as well as public and private properties. Some areas have even begun to remove living ash trees to try and prevent further spread of the emerald ash borer.
Species that arrives on the landscape begins to kill trees and nothing is done to control that pest outbreak, then what are the ecological consequences of that? So to do this, we used invasive wood-boring insect, the emerald ash borer, that at the time was ravaging southwestern Ontario. And we found that the rapid loss of ash resulted in the large reduction in the amount of ash leaves that were deposited on the forest floor and in adjacent streams in the autumn. And so therefore the sudden reduction in ash leaf litter input to those systems resulted in a sudden and clear reduction in a high quality food source for those leaf litter consumers. And that had implications for actual energy cycling within those systems, both on the forest floor, in the adjacent streams.
When invasive insects arrive, if unidentified and unmanaged, they can cause untold damage to the forest. Defoliation, destruction, limb death, ultimately tree death. And that, if you play that out, has a big impact upon the forest ecosystem. You take that on a landscape scale, it's massive. It's millions of acres. We've seen that happen with the Native American elm. We're seeing it now with the ash species, with the ash borer. This will continue unabated for years, and it changes. It takes those species of trees out. Often they're riparian species in and around streams and that. It has a huge impact on removing a single species from the forest environment.
I think this kind of complexity, it's a very difficult thing for people because it's a natural human thing to try to say, oh, there's one cause for all of our problems. And that cause is climate change, or that problem is biological invasions. And in many cases, it's not one cause. It's many causes, and they interact in complex ways, and they make it very difficult for us to identify effective strategies for managing those problems.
Dobbiamo pensare che le foreste si sono evolute in millenni e si sono selezionate quelle piante e quegli ecosistemi che man mano si sono adattate alle condizioni climatiche che subivano dei mutamenti, come pure si sono adattate alle nuove malattie, a nuovi insetti. Quindi in realtà nel lungo periodo le foreste hanno la capacità, la cosiddetta resilienza, la capacità, se si è a disposizione di abbastanza spazio e di abbastanza tempo, di ricostituirsi e di ristabilire, diciamo, il loro grado di sanità, di salute. Ovviamente però l'uomo non può aspettare questi tempi così lunghi e deve cercare di risolvere questi problemi nell'immediato. Ed è diciamo un obiettivo piuttosto difficile.
The difference between forestry and agriculture is you make investments that are 40 to 80 years before you get your return. So the average commercial forests is on about an 80-year rotation. So if you've made investments that you want to have this forest for parks, paper, for the people, that's what brought everyone, or us, people like myself and others, so they could keep the forest green, healthy, and productive. The cost of protecting the forest is minimal compared to the return that you get on your investment.
If experience has taught us anything, it is that forest protection is a team effort, relying upon skills, expertise, and collaboration from many different organizations and individuals.
I think that over the last several decades, of course, the world has become a more globalized thing, and the need for international collaboration is something it's expanded. It's more than just the US and Canada. It's really the whole world. I think that especially with the biological invasion problem, the importance of international communication is especially important, because many of these same organisms that are invading one part of the world are invading other parts of the world and causing very similar problems.
Many of these problems originate in other countries. often the best solutions come from those same countries. So this has developed a need for organizations like IRUFRO, the International Union of Forest Research Organizations, to help develop solutions for these problems. So what happens in Cyprus or in China or in Canada or the US, we all have to work together on a global basis because often the problems originate elsewhere, but the solutions also come there.
There's a lot of strategizing needed to help maintain a healthy forest and to control forest pests, especially when large or economically significant areas of forest are under threat. One of the most common, efficient, cost-effective, and safe ways to treat forest pests is by aerial application. The first aerial applications were conducted over a century ago, and since that time, scientists, engineers, and regulators have worked together to improve the products available and the technology to apply them. During that 100 years, forest protection has shifted primarily from chemicals to lower-risk, environmentally compatible biological products. A biological insecticide, derived from a naturally occurring soil bacteria, was commercially developed for use in agriculture and forestry. This biological is target-specific and has little to no impact on non-targets, including beneficial insects, fish, birds, or wildlife.
The most commonly and widely used insecticide of that nature now would be a product known as BTK, and that is Bacillus thuringiensis christaki. It is specific only to those pests that are caterpillar pests, and it works uniquely in that it has to be ingested or eaten. So there's been a lot of time and effort spent to determine how to atomize the BTK pesticides so that the caterpillar pests, which are eating the leaves on your tree or in the forest, will come in contact and will actually consume those small spray droplets. When they consume the BTK, it sets up a reaction in the insect's gut, and it actually works. It's specific. It's like a lock and key. It's triggered by the specific pH of the insect's gut and sets up an exchange, and ultimately it perforates the lining of the insect gut, and it kills the insects. And this happens very quickly within a day, and it's specific only to those pests that are lepidoptera, in other words, caterpillar pests only.
Understanding insect population dynamics becomes really important, particularly in some of the programs that have been tried in forest health against insect protection. The two examples that come to mind are the gypsy moth Slow the Spread program and the spruce budworm early intervention program.
The USDA National Slow the Spread of Lymantria dispar program was established in 2000. Each year, federal and state agencies work together to continue the program in an effort to slow the spread of spongy moth across the United States. It has become one of the world's largest and most successful integrated pest management programs, so it is used as a model by others when considering the management of other forest pests.
The tools we use now for management of gypsy moth have been developed over years of research and application at the state and federal level. The Slow the Spread program uses traps and lures to detect low-level gypsy moth populations before they become really established and cause damage. Without gypsy moth Slow the Spread, it is thought that gypsy moth spread rate would have been about 13 miles per year. With gypsy moth Slow the Spread program, we've cut that down to about 3 miles per year. Over the past 30 or 40 years, insect pheromones have become an important tool for forest pest management. We use pheromones for detecting populations of natives, monitoring populations of native insects, using them for control, such as in the gypsy moth program, or even detecting new non-native invasive species. Pheromones are chemicals produced by insects. Analogous would be pheromones, which are chemicals produced by, say, trees, host odors, and those kind of things. So those are used in various ways. One of the programs I'm involved with, early detection, rapid response, we use pheromones near ports and other wood packing places such as warehouses and such to see if there's non-native species coming off of ships or dunnage or solid wood packing material to detect those things early.
The complexity of combining weather information with the mathematics of development of the insect led us to the development of a system that we call BioSim. BioSim is then a tool that takes this information, this weather information, and feeds it to our mathematical models of insect development to predict the development of the insect anywhere at any time in order for pest managers to better time the application of management strategies such as monitoring and treatments. The beauty of BioSim is that it's not specific to a particular insect. It's a generic kind of approach, so we can provide BioSim with models of anything we want as long as the model requires the same kind of input. For example, weather such as temperature and precipitation, then we can produce outputs. An example of that is fire weather. We can predict fire risk with BioSim by applying the same weather information that we use for insect development to a forest fire model. One of the advantages also of BioSim is that it can predict the future through climate change scenarios. So instead of using observations of weather that are provided by the weather services, we can use the outputs of global circulation models to feed into our models and tell us how the insects and how fire and how other processes that respond to temperature are going to react to climate change in the future. So BioSim has been used for all of these purposes throughout the world.
We don't all need to be foresters or researchers to help protect our forests. There are programs all over the world to help all of us contribute to a healthy forest. I'm sure we're all familiar with the Only You Can Prevent Forest Fires campaign. Everyone can help by being careful about what you bring into an area.
Community members can take it on themselves to fire smart their properties, and that's actually been shown to be extremely effective in terms of preventing fire from consuming a house or impacting a neighborhood. The neighborhoods that have been fire smarted and following fire smart principles are much more likely to survive in a fire. And so it's very important for communities to understand how to fire smart, where they can find those tools, and what funding might be available from a community or a city level to help to fire smart or fuels manage around a community. What we've seen is that projects that are community driven are more likely to be successful, or those projects that have a champion, and especially ecological restoration or prescribed fires. So that bottom-up approach to fuels management and prevention around a community can be very, very successful.
To conclude, we asked the experts you've seen throughout the series if they had any final thoughts for future generations, knowing that we only scratched the surface of the knowledge they acquired during their career.
The world doesn't stand still, that society changes. Society changes in many different ways. And I think from a forest health specialist, it's very important to stay flexible and to sort of recognize those trends and to move with those trends and to try to be at the forefront of those changes.
It's really important that we take efforts to try to convey to the general public and to future students that are in schools right now about forests and about forest health and about forest management. They're an important part of our ecosystems. Is at least trying to convey in terms understandable by the general public what we're doing and why we're doing it, so they become our allies rather than being kind of against the work that's going on.
I think if I were providing advice to young people, which I do, the first and perhaps foremost I would say is learn to listen. Learn to take the concerns seriously, learn how to address them.
My advice to a young practitioner or a student who's thinking of going into forest health, forest protection fields will be avoid the lure of too much technology. Stick to the basics. You have to do basic scientific research. Then you can use technology to apply the knowledge. But to develop technology without knowledge underneath is pointless in the long term.
I would say that I would just caution there's a lot of knowledge retiring. And I don't know that there's a book or whatever you can go to get that knowledge. I think you just plain have to reach out, realize that while you're in charge today, and those people that worked at it for their lifetimes know a whole lot about how to make it happen and what kind of issues are going to arise and how to be in front of some of the things.
Forest health is very interdisciplinary. There's a lot of different avenues that you can look at, and you get to work with people from all across different sectors in natural resources and beyond. And it really opened my eyes to start to work in forest health and to see that I could work in ecological restoration, and I could also work with the local entomologist at the same time. So it allows you to be able to explore different avenues that you might find interesting.
For a new person that wants to get involved in forest protection, I would say be curious, be proactive, and try to improve things. If some things have been done in a certain ways in the past, that doesn't mean that it has to be done the same way in the future.
I have to recognize there's something about working within the forests that have just captured my attention, but it's more than that. Captured my attention, but I'd have to say it's captured my essence, my spirit. So I feel kind of a kinship in a forest environment. Something about being there that just connects me to the land, and forest ecosystems just resonate very strongly with me. It's been a real privilege to work there.
We hope that this has given you more insight into the value of backyard trees, parks, woodlands, and forests, and that protecting this resource is important to us all. From providing clean air and water, wildlife habitat, recreation and wilderness areas, food sources, as well as numerous forest products, all produced from renewable sources. Forests are extremely valuable to everyone. We encourage you to get out and experience the beauty and tranquility of the forest, and perhaps be inspired to start your own forest by planting a tree or two.